Welcome to Human Ecology. Ross Gittins' multi-decade mission as economics editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, with a thrice-weekly column, has been to serve the reader, to explain the economy, the government and its policies, to demystify a complex subject. And while he's enjoyed focusing on economics, it's clear he has a broader worldview, underpinned by a strong ethical framework. If only there were more like Ross in the media. The role of government features heavily in this conversation. I wanted to focus on this with Ross because he has a slightly more expansive view of government than me, and I wanted to explore that. The focus is on how the government can support and also diminish human flourishing. Both Ross and I were battling winter sickness during recording. Reliable as ever though, Ross delivered the goods. Here's my conversation with Ross Gittins. So really, Ross, what I wanted to start with was, I guess, your take on human ecology. What does it mean to you? What makes for good human ecology? What's your perspective on that term?
Well, I've done a lot of writing and reading about happiness and about the environment, but as well as all the standard stuff about the economy. And I really think that the most important thing is personal relationships, getting them right. And I think that the main thing people do wrong is to neglect their personal relationships. Now, I wouldn't say that I was perfect myself, and my wife would assure you that I wasn't perfect, but I do think that is a key. It's those relationships that really matter most to us. I think the other thing where we can get wrong is thinking that the more we buy, the happier we can be. And part of that is an attitude that you think, well, I want to be happy, so I've got to do all these things that I can do to make myself happy. That's actually the wrong way to be happy. The right way to be happy is to focus on the happiness of others, and that's what gives you genuine satisfaction. And that, which gets back to personal relationships. Then you get the question of whether money buys happiness. And the answer is it does and it doesn't. It's certainly true that if you don't have any money, it's a lot harder. If you're very, very poor, it's a lot harder to be happy than if you've got enough money. But it's a mistake to think that the more money you got, the happier you'll be. Because it's really, in the end, it's if you've got enough. And the real difficulty people have, I think, is realizing that when it comes to money, having enough is good. But if you think that just getting more and more of it will make you happier, then that's a mistake.
Just picking up on the relationships point, you sort of mentioned serving others, which is, you can become happy by sort of taking yourself out of yourself and focusing on others, which is a very Christian perspective. Do you see sort of living that Christian life and even the Christian underpinnings of our fairly secular society? Do you see that as really critical for flourishing and happiness?
Yes, I do. And I think that what my upbringing has left me with is the belief that the kind of Christian ethical system is a good one, and you can believe in that, and you can think that you want to have it affect your own behaviour and the behaviour of others, without buying all the kind of supernatural things that Christianity gives. People find it very hard to understand that when you've grown up in a Christian country, like all of us have, almost all of us have, not all of us, then that Christian ethic permeates what everybody thinks is the moral way to do things, even if you have not bought the kind of religious package about Jesus and all the rest of it.
Yeah. I think there's a very strong recognition that even in our fairly secular society, there's a growing recognition that we do owe a lot to the Christian heritage, and that it is essential
Well, I've found that when I've said that, a lot of people have criticised me and disagreed and say, no, it has absolutely nothing to do with Christianity. Well, it does. Because you can separate the ethics from the theology, but it doesn't mean that that's not where the ethics came from.
They still permeate society. I guess it's probably more effective if you do believe the whole framework. But even just the teachings of Jesus, he really just, for me, a recent convert, he really just raised my gaze, as in my expectations, what I thought was possible, what I thought I should aim at and try to be. Now that I have a different conception of morality, I realize that you can aim a lot higher if you have that framework and that direction that the church gives you. Maybe let's pivot a little bit. We've got a lot to get through. Can I ask, you've been a public intellectual, public commentator for about 50 years, journalist and thrice weekly column for decades. And I've noticed your goal seems to be to serve the reader, and that seems to be your ethic, that you need to inform and serve the reader as to what is beneficial for them and what's going to help them. I'm finding the media environment at the moment quite toxic, particularly in the US. I mean, the US is toxic in many ways, I think. Maybe less so here. But it does seem as though the media environment is going through a challenging time, and the ethics seem to be a little bit compromised, but you seem to still be doing your thing, and you've maintained your role, basically, of your function of what you see yourself doing. Do we need an ethical foundation for journalists, commentators, intellectuals who it seems they maybe lack skin in the game, they're not held as accountable, they can sort of say one thing and then move on at another time, and they don't seem to necessarily suffer the consequences, especially if there's a bit of groupthink, they can all move together. How do you see the media environment at the moment? And do we need a more ethical foundation for these workers?
Yes, we do. As you say, my ethic has been, and it took me a while to realise that this is what I believed in, and I also believed that it was a commercially successful strategy. The thing about the media is that it is, for the most part, take out the ABC and SBS, it's a money-making institution. They're there. There are businesses that are there to make money. You've got to accept that, but we must have, in a democracy, people rely on the media to tell them about what's going on in the democracy, what governments are doing. A big part of the role of the media is to hold power to account, including particularly the government, but also big business and big unions. So that means that, yes, we are there to make a buck, and we do have to make a buck, because if we don't, the company will collapse. But we have to have a higher purpose, and we have to be conscious of that higher purpose, which is to play, to put it in grand terms, to play our part in the democratic process, which won't work well without some intermediary spending a lot of time and effort ensuring that their customers, their readers, are well informed about what the government's doing. And that's a big part of what I've been doing. I don't just try not to just sit there and criticise, and you can always find something to criticise. That's easy. What I want to do is explain to people how things work, how the economy works, how the government's role in the economy works, what the government, when the government does this, what's it trying to achieve. Often there's a kind of theoretical background to that. You know, why did the Treasurer say we had to do X? Because Treasury told him that's what we needed. Why did Treasury tell him that was what we needed? Because that's what the theory says should happen. And I like to be able to bring that out. But also another role that I like to play is to help readers make sense of just the blizzard of information about the economy that the media throws at them. And the media is a very daily thing. And what happens today, we want to make it out to be a really big deal. Well, sometimes what happens today isn't all that important. And in fact, something that happened 10 years ago is really important. Now, I see my role as saying, part of my role is saying, look, worry about these bits, don't worry about that bit. But I've spent my life trying to figure out how the economy works. And when I get something figured, I try to explain it to my readers. And I find that doing that gives me a lot of readers who like reading me. So I find it hugely gratifying.
It sounds like there's still a role for the commentator that is telling the truth and what the readers, I guess. I mean, a lot of readers will want that, but not all readers will. And partly, I guess, the incentives in the media environment are dictated by what the readers want. So I guess we can't put it all on the journalists, but it's good to see that there's still room for integrity in journalism and commentary. And also, I guess, the role you play going through the budgets, going through some of the nitty gritty of these policies that others may not have the time or expertise to go through is a real service. You've gone through a lot of budgets and you've watched a lot of governments over the years. You've got that perspective that you can bring. Looking back now, what do you see as the role and scope of government in Australia?
Well, I think that, this sounds terribly simplistic, but the government's there to make our lives better, and they do that by holding the ring, by enforcing laws that we have to live by, and that a kind of capitalist economy has belief in private property and all the rest of that stuff. But there are things that are best done by the government, and certainly are best paid for by the government. There are other things that can perfectly adequately be left to the private sector and the profit motive, but we've got to get that right. And I think one of the things I've realised in recent years is that the capitalist system, the market system, has to be protected from its own excesses. Because if the idea that the private sector should be free to do everything that it wants to do unless it's sort of outright illegal, can get them into a lot of trouble, because competition is a very powerful force, and you can get people who are locked in competition who end up doing things that are damaging to themselves and to their customers. And so I think that there is a big role for governments to ensure that the private sector doesn't exceed itself and do things that ultimately will be damaging to us and to them.
I think I sort of come from, I think we probably come from slightly different perspectives in that my view on government, at least my bias is to smaller government. Um, but I've got to admit, over the years, I've come to see um, a larger role for government as maybe just an essential part of a big modern society where there's millions of people, no one knows each other. You need some sort of focal point in government. And if we just think about, for example, um, how to deal with disputes and what are the rules for certain conducts and behaviors and interactions, you can use, you can resolve your disputes through courts, or you can have regulation as just like a dichotomy of different options for dealing with things. And it seems to me that there is great efficiency from actually regulating. Normally on the free market side of things, you will hear that regulation is crushing business, and it is inefficient. And obviously that's everyone agrees that some regulation is needed. But I want to introduce a concept called the regulatory or legal Laffer curve. So just to explain for the listeners, the Laffer curve, when applied to tax revenue, is when you increase taxes, you get more tax revenue, which sounds intuitive. But I guess if your taxes are too high and it's causing too many distortions, too many behavior changes, you can actually get less revenue as a government. So you want to be on that left side of the Laffer curve. That is, as you increase taxes, you're actually increasing revenue for the government. Now, for the regulatory Laffer curve, as you increase regulation, you're actually getting more growth, more efficiency, because you're clearly defining and setting out through ideally expert regulators or regulators that have an idea of what's going on in those fields. You can clearly set out rules for engagement in that industry, and you can also enforce, rather than having to use the common law, civil law, private law, and enforcement through courts. Now, I guess the question is, where is Australia at on that Laffer curve?
Well, I mean, I like I agree with the Laffer curve, but I just think of it differently, and that is that what I think is you can go to one extreme or the other. You can have no government, or you can have total government. What I've always thought is that the answer is somewhere between those two things, and as you imply, the hard part is working out the best combination, where the sweet spot is, where you've got enough government intervention and enough private enterprise initiative, rather than too little. Now, that's kind of a truism, but understanding that is saying, well, what we should be doing is not saying we got too much of this, we got too much of the other, but trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And we have spent the last 30 years working on a simple proposition that says smaller is always better. And I don't think that's been borne out. And while we've been trying to keep the lid on the size of government, we haven't been doing what's much harder, and that is to say, we're spending this money to try and achieve this purpose. How's it going? What ways of trying to achieve that purpose do we know from experience work, and what ways do we know doesn't work? What works and what doesn't work? Now, we don't know nearly as much about that as we should, because we haven't actually spent the last 30 years trying to find that out. We've spent the last 30 years working on the basis that if we were more that side than this side, it'd all been better. Well, we've done that, and it isn't all better. And I actually believe that we would be better off if we paid higher taxes. But part of that has to be putting a lot more effort into making sure that those taxes are well spent.
Yeah, and I think you've mentioned just the importance of good government and actually reforming the way we do government so that we are focused on really efficient, effective outcomes. But I guess that also plays into the broader debate. Government's probably as good as we let it be. It's a democracy. There's a media environment, and it does seem like we sort of get tribal left and right, pro-regulation, pro-market, and often debating each other, and often the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's a more of a technical answer maybe, but we nonetheless we play into these different tribal visions of the world that might impede actually coming to the right outcome.
Yes, I think that very much. And the two-party political system tends to kind of push us in that direction. Okay, you're saying white, I'll say black. And I'll just hope that there are more voters who believe black than voters who believe white. Well, that's one way to do it, but it's not a very good way. And it probably ignores the fact that most people are somewhere in the middle themselves. And if you go to the electorate with an approach that's too far in one extreme or the other, you're probably not going to get very far.
Yeah, exactly. Ross, maybe we can dig into a couple of examples of this regulatory or legal Laffer curve. You wrote a great article a couple of weeks ago now, I think, on the building industry and the collusion or the cooperation between big construction, as in the businesses, and then big union that can kind of block the smaller players from actually participating, and it reduces competition. Is that an example of a lack of government, as in the government hasn't gotten in there, set the rules properly, enforced them, created effective competition, and that the players are maybe not playing by the rules to the degree that would be ideal for society? So is it a lack of proper government enforcement in that industry?
Yes, it is. But it's come from both sides, because the real problem, this is in the construction industry, the real problem is that you've got a kind of thuggish union, which when the media tells you about the things they've been up to, everyone's terribly shocked and saying, why doesn't the government fix this? Well, the government, both sides of government, have known about it for 40 years. And the reason they haven't fixed it is because a lot of what those thugs are doing is stuff that the handful of really big construction companies are perfectly happy to have happen, because they've done it. There is a deal, explicit or implicit, between the two sides. And it's certainly true that one of the worst situations you can get is where big business and big unions get together and do a deal, which will be a deal that's done at the expense of the customers. You can be sure of that. And both sides, I'm getting my cut, you're getting your cut, and we're ripping off the customer. What's the problem? That's really what's happening in construction. It's been happening for 30 years. We've had 3 royal commissions that have pointed this out, and neither side of politics has wanted to do it. Labor doesn't want to do it because that would offend a big union and powerful union. The Libs don't want to do it because the big construction companies are saying, look, go easy. Yes.
Yeah. It was a fascinating column when I read it. It reminds me of a fantastic movie. I'll just briefly mention. It's called A Most Violent Year. It's set in 1980, and it revolves around energy companies providing heating oil to households, basically. And the industry hasn't been cleaned up. There's nefarious activities, there's fraud, there's violence, and the scope of the movie is basically trying to be moral in that world. Trying to live a moral life, and yet you're in a dirty industry that the government hasn't cleaned up yet. To me, that's a perfect example of the necessity of government to really set those rules and enforce them and ensure fair play. Otherwise, there's just too many incentives and money to be made from doing the wrong thing. Another example, I guess, of moving up that Laffer curve. Ross, let's briefly talk COVID without going too far into it. Obviously, COVID was a government response that was perhaps, to put it mildly, on the other side of the Laffer curve. Now, I know we were flying blind. We didn't have a lot of information. There was a lot of panic, and so mistakes were made. I guess we need to be charitable about that. But nonetheless, it was quite a blunt response that did have major side effects on people. I guess we solved for one variable, which was health. I guess there's a couple of frameworks I want to put to you for your reaction. One of them, decisions in COVID that are categorical versus incremental. So a categorical decision is the government saying you cannot do this, yes or no, black and white. And that decision is made at a distance. That's a blunt instrument. It's going to have side effects, but nonetheless, it's a clear rule that you can enforce. Versus incremental choices. If you put the decision on individuals, and individuals are walking around, they're basically producing externalities. They're transmitting the virus. But they're making incremental decisions, so they can take on more or less risk based on their information and their risk preferences, and their information is also not accurate and possibly less useful than what the government has. But nonetheless, they know their preferences, they know their risk preferences, and they know their trade-offs. So we really chose to go for a at-distance, centralized, categorical set of decisions rather than a decentralized, incremental set of decisions. So we basically said we don't want the externalities involved in people socializing and engaging in economic activity. We will make the call. And then this is where it gets into the second framework, which is the Ronald Coase, the Coasean view, which is that in this instance, you've got reciprocal costs. So individuals that go out and engage in economic activity, for example, they're a risk to the higher risk people, for example, in nursing homes. But you could say, and this is Ronald Coase's argument, that the people in aged care homes are imposing a cost on the young people if the young people can't actually engage in economic activity. So the externalities or the costs on each other are reciprocal. It's not necessarily one way. Now, that's where the government has to basically allocate who has the right to safety or who has the right to move around. So in this case, they opted to protect the vulnerable. And perhaps that's the right choice. There's trade-offs involved in that. With the Coasean view, if transaction costs are low enough, if people can actually bargain with each other, they can make trades that work for them. But because people aren't able to do that, the transaction costs are too high. The government basically has to allocate who has the right. And so they said, okay, we're going to lock down, we're going to protect the vulnerable. And that's the role of when transaction costs are high. Often the government has to basically decide, and that's the way that they went. And I guess we're thinking whether that was the right choice. Do you have any reflections on those frameworks related to COVID, Ross?
Oh, yes, I do, and I think the transaction costs are very high, and the best answer, which won't necessarily be a perfect answer, is for the government to come in over the top and impose a solution on the situation. And, you can have an argument that says, well, look, why are all these young people being inconvenienced in many ways? And in turn, it turned out that the way we did it meant that a lot of young people lost a lot of schooling, and a lot of young people are still very unhappy about that episode, made unhappy by that episode, and we were saying, well, look, there are all these old people who could quite possibly die from the thing. And by the way, that would probably include me. So we're really going to we're not going to say, some kind of more rational people are saying, listen, an old guy like Ross Gittins is almost at the end of the road. Why impose all this cost on people for whom the virus isn't a great threat, just to allow him to live a few more years? Well, the government, you can say that, but the government wasn't prepared to do that. And I think that it was prepared to say, look, they might be old, but we're still going to inconvenience everybody else to try and stop them being killed by this virus, so that they're killed by something else. And I mean, anybody who stood up with that kind of rational thing, and I know a couple of economists who did, they really got turned on by everybody. So I don't doubt that the politicians jumped the way that the majority of Australians felt that the government should do, which is to protect the lives of the most vulnerable, even though you could argue they're almost dead anyway. What's the problem? So I think the government jumped the right way. And I think that, with things like saying you got to wear a mask, you got to be vaccinated, I think it's really strange to think that this is a huge imposition on my personal liberty, and I'm not going to buy it. If I don't feel like wearing a mask, it's my right. Well, that would be a more defensible position if it was only your own life that you were putting at risk, not the lives of all the people that you if you had the virus, would spread it to. So I think that that's a clear case. And the other thing to remember is we don't have perfect information, and I don't believe that we're all terribly rational, that we weigh up all the information that's available and say, well, that's my choice. I think that there's a very good case for saying the government just comes in on over the top and imposes a solution that can be argued about, as we've discussed, because the probability of being killed by that virus was very unevenly distributed. And that's the real thing that we're arguing about. But I think the government had enormous support from the public, all the governments, and all the governments were involved in agreeing on this. That most Australians wanted done. They did want old people to be protected at some inconvenience and expense to the rest of us.
I guess effectively what we did is there was sort of effectively bargaining going on through the government. The government makes a call. They decide on who has the rights, who doesn't have the rights, and they basically compensate the other party. So it has acted in a coherent way to solve that problem for us, to reduce those transaction costs and solve the problem. I wonder, though, whether there was a middle ground. If we've talked tonight about the middle ground of in different industries in terms of regulation, is it not one or the other, but maybe it's a more targeted approach? I understand that before the pandemic, we did have some plans in place that were a little more targeted, and then it seemed like we kind of panicked because we didn't have information, and we kind of just had to solve the problem in any way we could. But I wonder going forward whether we will have a more targeted approach if we have a similar virus, or whether we would do it again if people, in hindsight, it'd be interesting to see with people in hindsight, looking back, whether they thought it was the right thing. But definitely at the time, I think there was strong support for that bargain that occurred through government.
Yes, well, I think that's right. And I think that probably when the next virus comes, we'll do it the same. But, I mean, what really happened was the econocrats would say, look, we were misled by the medicos. They kind of told us it'd be much worse than it was. And if you're really cynical, you could say, well, look, the medicos were interested in solving their own problem, which was they didn't want hospitals overrun and in a way that would make them have to make the most excruciating choices between who gets into hospital and lives and who doesn't get into hospital and dies. And so they advocated for an arrangement that minimised the discomfort to them. Now, I wouldn't actually run with that argument, but I think there's probably some truth to it, and you've got to be careful because when if you take all your advice from the economists, they'll give you advice that makes sense to economists and not necessarily to other people. And if you take all your advice from doctors, they will advocate a solution which will be very, very probably very good at saving lives and stopping the spread of illness, but it will also be hugely expensive. So that's part of the problem for governments. They've got to get advice from experts in different fields and decide where they come down between them. But with the wisdom of hindsight, it's clear that the government, the Reserve Bank, the federal government and the state governments pumped far too much stimulus into the economy, which is the reason why, apart from the problems that were caused by international shortages of supply, the rest of it was because we applied too much stimulus and we got all this inflation, which we are still struggling to get on top of. And always, and just about any method that you use to try and get demand down so that it doesn't exceed supply and cause price increases is going to be painful.
Yeah, and we're in a unique situation at the moment where unemployment's rising, the economy's slowing, and inflation is 3.8%. It's a bit unprecedented for me, I think. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from here. I guess people are so indebted that you cannot have a cash rate that is what it was in 2007, 7.25, I think by 2008 it was. So very interesting times for macroeconomic management ahead. Ross, do you mind if we pivot for our final section? I want to unpack with you morality, particularly around charity and welfare and the role of government. You mentioned on Richard Feidler not too long ago, you made a point about the undeserving poor. Can you start off by telling us what you mean by the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, and the role of Christianity in that?
Well, this is something that comes very much from my own Christian upbringing, but there is a tendency among people to be very judgmental about the poor and say, well, look, if it all happened through no fault of your own, then you're the deserving poor. And if you did something wrong, if you wasting all this money on smoking, and then you tell me you can't afford a meal, you're the undeserving poor. And the attitude that the founder of the Salvation Army had was that he just was not buying any proposition that says you divide the deserving, the poor, the needy, the disadvantaged into two boxes: those who have done nothing to contribute to their own problem, and those who have, and the ones who are virtuous we'll help, and the ones who've caused it by their own folly we won't help. And his attitude was, no, everyone who needs help should be getting it, and we shouldn't be making these moral judgments about them. Often you'll be making them with utterly insufficient information. It may well be. I mean, none of us are perfect. And it may well be that all of us have done things that have contributed to the problems we have. And we shouldn't be running around judging other people, especially when we don't know why they did that. Maybe their parents set them a bad example or whatever.
Yeah, that's a teaching that comes through to me as well as a Catholic. And I guess the lack of judgment as well, going about your life and just trying to give love and charity to others rather than judging them. But I want to unpack what institutions do need to make that distinction. I'm thinking about the rise of government sort of supplanting the friendly and fraternal societies that were around in the 1800s and early 1900s. So just, I guess, for the audience, these are organizations that people joined that provided life insurance, income insurance, fraternity, self-development. Different chapters and organizations had different aspirations, but I guess there were some common underlying themes. Now, they did make a distinction between the deserving and the undeserving in that they basically held behavioral moral standards for their members. Benefits might be not given based on certain behaviors. So I think they drew a line. And I guess what I'm getting at is I think they drew a line in order to perpetuate the financial stability of that organization and to serve the members. And I think this might be partly where the rise of government comes in, because if they're making a distinction, there's still the role for charity for the undeserving, in quotes, that are not served by these fraternal friendly societies. And I guess if not everyone is served and charity is insufficient, government can provide the solution. But I guess the tension there is that the financial solvency of those societies was dependent on them making that distinction between deserving and undeserving. Now, the government, Western governments are sort of bleeding money. Is the government sort of running a risk that it is going to become eventually not solvent?
Well, I think that it's a good thing that high-income people like me pay a lot more tax than people on lower incomes, and that tax is used to help people who are disadvantaged relative to me. What does that do? Does that absolve me from worrying about them? Will that be a perfect solution? It won't be a perfect solution. And the fact I can use the fact that I pay a lot of tax as an excuse for not doing things to support charities or help individuals that I see around me who need help. I can use that as an excuse, but that's all it is. I think it's good to have the government doing the most of the heavy lifting to help the disadvantaged and getting the rest of us, especially people who can afford to help, compelling us to help. But they don't come anywhere near reducing the need. The government has rules about who deserves to be helped, which they have by all of their rules about whether you're eligible for something or you aren't eligible for it. But there's still plenty of need and no excuse for anyone who can afford it to do charitable acts of their own volition on top of whatever the government forces them to do. It's about saying that we need the optimum combination of people accepting personal responsibility for their own affairs and their own well-being, and the government helping them by means that are imposed certainly on the taxpayers who pay for it. I don't think it's realistic to think that in our complicated world you can have a situation where you can say, buyer beware. Just make sure that nobody rips you off. Just check it all out, and it just would not be possible for you to spend your life ensuring that you weren't being ripped off by some business or some scammer without the government coming in and making that kind of extreme behaviour illegal, and imposing rules on businesses that said you can't sell faulty products, and if you do, there'll be legal redress for the people you sold them to. You cannot run the world in a way that says if you didn't spend your entire life checking out the people that you do business with, then that's your fault. It's just not a sensible idea. It's not humanly possible, and it's not a smart way to run the country.
Yeah, and I guess what is just, what is owed to people. A lot of people's success can be, because they've been given certain talents or they've been born into certain situations that are beneficial for them, and others are the opposite. And also, I guess the fact that the earth and the land, really does, at the end of the day, it is for the benefit of everyone, and everyone should benefit the fruits. And if you've been more lucky than others, I guess you've got more of a responsibility to contribute, whether that is through, on behalf of you by government, whether that is giving what you can through charity. Nonetheless, we have those systems in place basically as a basic social justice mechanism because of the inequality and distribution of talents and circumstances. And if you want to have the modern day equivalent of friendly fraternal societies, is basically insurance companies, which will have exclusions and which will have behavioural conditions that they need to maintain, then that's good. But the government is a safety net, and charity is an instance where people can give charity, and not just charity, but friendship, love, and outreach to their fellow man, which can, I guess, combat some of the impersonality of the government. And I guess part of what's driving this question is to understand the different aspects of these trade-offs and morality, but also that there is a cost to society. That big bureaucratic government, it can be impersonal, it can be crushing for people. And I think there is a degree to which government can crowd out personal interactions and relationships. I'd like to see if you agree with that. Maybe to finish, if the government actually does crowd that out, obviously we are at liberty to be in those relationships, but whether, because we have they're less essential these days because we have that government safety net, that there is a bit of crowding out, and that therefore that charity really becomes more essential, and making that effort beyond government, and not just accepting government as it is, but actually going out of your way and really thinking about the other person. You can combat the rise of government and some of the negatives that come with that. Would you agree with that, Ross?
Well, I don't. I agree with the half that says you don't absolve yourself of personal responsibility because the government's done it all for you. Because the government hasn't done it all, and you will undoubtedly come across people in your own circumstances, in your own where in your own life, who could benefit from your help. If I say, well, if I wasn't, I'd love to help you, but if I wasn't taxed as much as I am, I would. That's just an excuse. As for friendly societies, I mean, it's a free country, and if the members of a friendly society voluntarily join together in a society that has rules that says, well, all these people who conform to these things will be helped, and those who don't won't be. If all that's a voluntary agreement between all the members, there is absolutely nothing that anyone outside that group should say is unacceptable to them.
Yeah. And I guess now you're free to do that. Now, I guess the market through, financial companies basically deal with most of that. And I guess you get your friendships and your moral formation and whatnot from elsewhere, for example, the church, which is also in the decline. But I guess that nonetheless, we've got more liberty now because big government helped us detach from some of these more communal aspects. We kind of have to really be self-conscious in choosing those things to enhance our lives, rather than just being the individual with your nuclear family and the government and the market. I think we really need to be conscious about how we live our lives to have that true human ecology. I mean, we've talked about big government is important and it is efficient in many ways. I think there are some side effects. We probably need to be conscious of that and building community, things that are going to make us flourish, enable us to flourish, so that we don't accept that the government can take care of everything, because it inevitably won't, and that will disappoint in many ways.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I guess we've come full circle, Ross. We've come back to human ecology, and I think that's probably a good place to finish. Really appreciate your time today, Ross. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.